Good evening, and you're very welcome along to the latest in the Sligo GA Coaching and Games webinar series. This evening, we're focusing on a common sense approach towards managing load on returning to club competition, as many teams right across Sligo will be or have been doing in the past week or so. Tonight's webinar will be delivered by the Sligo GA Performance GDA, Louise Keane. Good evening, Louise.
Good evening, Dara. Thank you very much. So we'll get straight into things. I'm going to share my screen here now. So yeah, exactly. We're looking at, I suppose, managing load as we return to club competition. So we've already kind of had our short pre-seasons, if you like. And now it's looking at how we can manage load on players over the next few weeks, as we're probably already started back into competition, whether that's finishing off leagues or jumping into championship competition. So what we're going to look at over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is injury data. So there's already sports that have gone back. Some have even finished up seasons. And we're going to look at the injury data from those sports and what they've encountered. We'll also look at training, so kind of practical things that we can do during training or around training that's going to help minimize the risk of injury. We'll also look at recovery, I suppose training and recovery going hand in hand. How can we ensure our players are getting recovery between games and between training sessions, and just, I suppose, an overall kind of managing player load. Kind of looking back pretty much through our training strategies and our recovery strategies. So as we kind of have come back into competition, there's I suppose quite a lot of risk in terms of injuries just due to the situation that we're in. So obviously we've had a much shorter pre-season than we normally would have. And also we have had players going from doing a lot of long distance type of running, a lot of road running, and now going into short, high intensity sprints and a lot of change of direction. So because of that and because of the situation and a much condensed season, the chance of injury is going to be a lot higher. Now, we can't by any means prevent injuries, but we can certainly do things to reduce the risk of them happening as much as possible. And what we're going to look at first is we'll look at 3 different sports. So we'll look at the AFL in Australia, how they're coping with it, and we'll look at the Bundesliga, and we'll look at the NFL. So if we start off with the AFL, so they have gone back into competition. They're not finished their competition yet, but they're kind of around 7-8 rounds in. And they had a 3-week preseason. So again, like ourselves, much shorter than normal. And as a result of this, they've done a couple of things to, I suppose, try and help players as they're returning to play and to try and minimize the risk of injuries. So what they have looked at and what they have done is reduced matches by 20% in duration. So each quarter of AFL games are 4 minutes shorter, so 16 minutes of game time less overall. And they've done this for 2 reasons. So first of all, to reduce the physical burden on players, but also because of, I suppose it's again to reduce the physical kind of risk to players, but it's as a result not just of a shortened preseason, but as a result of more kind of intense and condensed schedule. So they're playing games more frequently than just week on week. They might be playing 2 games a week, or even 3 in the space of 7, 8 to 10 days. So they have gone through, we have kind of data on what they've done over the past 7 rounds. And as we can see, so the first round, it wasn't really too dissimilar to normal, but going into the second round, and as they've gone up, particularly up to round 5, there's a steady increase in injuries. So starting off around 6 injuries, right up to 19 in week 5, and then it's kind of starting to taper back down again. So we also have, so that's overall injuries, but we have and a bit of a notice on hamstring injuries as well. So obviously hamstring injuries we're going to be very aware of because of the high intensity sprint meters. We're going to see hamstring injuries happen, particularly when players have come off the back of doing long distance running. So they're not that kind of, they've lost that being used to continuous high intensity sprint meters. And now they're coming back into doing that. They're also doing a lot of change of direction, a lot of multi-directional movements, and the hamstring injuries are going to increase. And the AFL has seen that. They have, so as I've said, in the first week there wasn't really too much of an increase. But based on 2009, in the first 2 weeks, or in the third week, there was at least 5 hamstring injuries across 9 games, which is fairly significant. So as I've said, they have played more than kind of one game a week, and as a result of that, it has been a steady increase in injuries compared to last year, particularly hamstring injuries, and at the rate they're going, if that was to continue over the course of the season, they could see 126 hamstring injuries, which is obviously a pretty big number. Now the chances of that actually finishing off at 126 is probably not exactly what's going to happen, but they do have a very congested schedule over the next few weeks, so it'd be interesting to keep an eye and see where they do end up. But one of the probably most interesting things from particularly the hamstring injuries that they've seen, is that 85% of players who suffered hamstring injuries have had prior injuries. So that's definitely a red flag and something that we can look at within our own sport, within the GAA. So if players have had injuries before, whether it's hamstring or not, that we pay particular attention to them and keep in contact with them, keep checking in on them, checking if they're having any niggles, or if they're having any issues with prior injuries. There's actually a study that's come out recently that is showing that any kind of niggly injuries where we're not actually seeing player lose any pitch time, but they're complaining of niggles and they're being treated for injuries, that can, and a lot of the time, does lead on to injuries. So that's another thing that we can look at. So not just players that have had injuries before, but players that have had niggles or suffering from niggles, and making sure we manage them. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we could have players who are doing more work and more high intensity meters, and then players that were pulling back a little bit. And it's making sure that we do that. We do look at players who are at a higher risk because of having injuries before, or because of having kind of continuous little niggling injuries that maybe aren't costing them game time right now, but if we don't manage those players, they could then be losing time later on because of those niggles. Another area then is kind of making sure we're not rushing players back. So with 2 of the teams, North Melbourne and Fremantle, both of their captains suffered hamstring injuries, and were rushed back. Now it wasn't during, since they've restarted the season, it was actually before that. So they had hamstring injuries. They were rushed back in 20 weeks and 14 weeks, and have subsequently done more damage, and have then, both those teams have lost players who are obviously very significant being captains. So it's monitoring players, but also anybody who has suffered an injury. It's making sure we don't rush them back too soon and result in longer times on the sideline. So that is the AFL. If we look then at the Bundesliga, so the Bundesliga was, I think, the first sport and first competition to come back post lockdown. So they had a 66-day lockdown and came back to a 2.5-week preseason with 9 games post lockdown. So they've actually finished those 9 games. So the data we have from the Bundesliga is a full kind of tournament post lockdown. What they did to reduce kind of the physical burden on players was increase subs from 3 to 5. And what we've seen in the numbers from that is that pretty much all of the teams, so all 18 teams, have taken advantage of that and used more than 3 subs. The rate of injury from the Bundesliga went from 0.27 injuries per game last year to 0.56 over the course of these 9 games. So with the AFL, what we had was a kind of increase week on week or round on round in injuries, whereas here with the Bundesliga, that spike happened pretty much straight away. So from 0.27 injuries last year, straight up to within the first 3 matches, there was an increase to 0.74 injuries per game. And then that started to slow down over the course of the weeks. So for from match 4 to 6, dropping down to 0.56, and then from match 7 to 9, dropping down to 0.33, which is kind of closer to what it was last year. So if we look, even within the first week, it actually went up. It was even higher than over the course of the first 3 weeks. So in the first week post-lockdown, it was 0.88 injuries per game, which is an increase of 226% from the first week last year, which is a massive increase. Even looking before they even got into games, in the first, so the preseason, which was 2.5 weeks to 17 days, Dortmund had 5 starting players who suffered from injuries. So across the board, across 9 games within the 18 teams, there was an awful lot of injuries that had happened. The image here shows each team how many on average, how many players they had unavailable. If you calculate them up, that's a significant amount of injuries over the course of just 9 games. So really what we've seen is the shorter preseason, as a result of lockdown, not having access maybe to the same type of training as they would have before, coming back into condensed and intense schedules has definitely led to an increase in injury. And it's not just kind of as a result of COVID-19. If we look at the next slide, we have injury data from the NFL. So in 2011, they had a lockout as a result of a pay dispute. And their preseason went from 136 days again down to 17. So a massive reduction in days for preseason. And as kind of is a natural response, I suppose we try to get as much as possible done in those 17 days. And that for the NFL led to 11 players suffering from a ruptured Achilles tendon injuries, which is a very, very time-consuming and serious injury. So those players would have been out for a significant amount of time as a result of those injuries. And across the board, so across the 5 months, the rate of injuries was double the average. So it's not just as a result, I suppose, of a COVID lockout or a COVID lockdown, but as a result of a shortened preseason, a really intense game schedule, and going from, you know, not having that preparation that we would normally have and that running that we would normally have. So I suppose what we can look at now, having had our pre-season, even again as it was kind of short, we're now looking at what we can do over the next number of weeks. So in our competitions, most likely we'll have a game each week, maybe a week off, and then back into a game week. So making sure that we vary our load across the sessions and vary our intensity across the sessions is really important. So if you look at the image here, we have a in-season training framework, 7 days, looking at a game each week, or each weekend. So making sure that we have, after our game day, we go into a recovery period. So let's take that game day on a Saturday. We have Sunday, Monday for our players to recover. Possibly going in, if we're looking at, say, a Tuesday, Thursday training schedule, a Tuesday session might have a higher intensity and a higher loaded session. But as we go into that Thursday session, we're dropping off on our intensity and our load, and tapering back into the game the following Saturday. Now that's going to vary depending on the exact days of your schedule. You might have that as a Sunday game day. It may even be a Saturday-Sunday or a Sunday-Saturday, which is going to condense things even more. But the real key thing is to plan those weeks. So once we know when our games are, it's planning the sessions in between, planning the recovery in between, and the preparation between our last training session and our next game. So with, say, if we're having 2 training sessions, looking at the duration of those sessions. So maybe your Tuesday session, if your normal session is maybe an hour and 10 minutes, that's perfectly fine. Making sure that we have that planned out and we can have our high intensity session. But as we go into the next session, which might be on the Thursday, making sure that we're not doing the same volume of work. So we might reduce that to a 40-minute session. Does that mean that we can't have high intensity in there? Absolutely not. But we're making sure that the duration of that high intensity is less so that we can taper back into the next game. So that might mean that if we're looking at 300 sprint meters on the Tuesday, we're making sure that those high intensity sprint meters are less on the Thursday. So it's not a case of not doing anything high intensity, but it's making sure that it's reduced so that we're preparing for the next game. And that recovery is really, really important. That tapering of our week is really important in order to make sure that we're giving our players the best chance to be as prepared as possible for the next game. Coming back to our high intensity sprint meters, we definitely need to be doing high intensity sprint meters for our players to be used to it in game situations. A question that I get asked an awful lot is how to make our players faster. And if they're not sprinting, then the chances are they're not getting faster. The best way for us to improve speed is through running fast. It's through sprinting. So making sure that our players are doing high intensity sprinting during our training sessions. Kind of a recommendation on average would be for kind of 240 to 300 sprint meters in any given training session. So that would be kind of pretty regular type of sprint meters to be doing in a session. So if you're looking at 300 sprint meters, that could be broken down to 3 sprints at 10, 20, 30 and 40 meters. So that doesn't sound like an awful lot, but making sure they have the right rest and recovery in between, and making sure that they're getting 100% effort for those sprints will be really beneficial to making sure that they can then replicate that come game day and that their body is robust enough to be able to handle it. Again, making sure that if we're doing our 300 meters on Tuesday, and we have a game coming up on Saturday, that our Thursday session is slightly reduced than that 300 meters, so that we're allowing them enough time to recover for the game on the Saturday. Then again, kind of looking at really common sense stuff, but making sure our players are properly warmed up for our training sessions and for our games. I would use mobility programs for players, making sure that they have some movement prep work from that mobility program that they can do before a session. So they come down a little bit earlier, they come down, they do their little bit of movement prep. So that could be a little bit of foam rolling, a little bit of mini band work, and just going through movement patterns. So the likes of squats, RDLs, lunges, just different types of movements that they're preparing their body to go out into a training session. Then they come in, they do their warm up, making sure everything's dynamic and everything's moving, and then moving gradually into increasing the intensity, so that when they get to doing their sprint work, they're not jumping from kind of straight into a warm up straight into the sprint meters. They're gradually increasing as they go through the session in order to reach that sprint part of it. Other things then that we can look at around training, but maybe slightly outside of it, is communication. So we've looked at our AFL and our Bundesliga and the NFL. These guys have so much resources and so much money at their disposal, and yet they're still seeing this high rate of injuries. So not having that in the club, but how can we use what we do have in order to minimize that risk of injury? And probably one of the things we do best is that community feel and that communication that we have within our clubs, how well we know our players, and we have to use that to help us right now and make sure that we're giving our players the best chance of staying on the field as possible. So making sure that we're communicating with our players, especially those who are playing with multiple teams or multiple sports, making sure we're talking to them and we know what they're doing in the other sports, so we're not doubling their load just because they're playing extra sports. We can also use rate of perceived exertion as a guide to look and gauge how players are feeling, and how they feel session intensity is. So asking them a simple question of how they rate a session on a scale of 1 to 10. Now this is not a foolproof kind of measurement, it's just to give us an idea of how they're feeling. So you might have one player who, let's say, rates the session at an 8, even though you kind of feel that the session is a lot easier than that. Or you might have a player who has been absolutely bursted in a session and rates it at a 6, even though you can tell by them that it was much harder than that. So you have to, again, know your players, communicate with them in order to get a real kind of feeling of it, but it gives you an idea of how they feel. And maybe you might get a sense that actually a session has been harder for the players than you expected it to be, and it might just give you that little bit more information on how intense the sessions are, and looking at what we've discussed about tapering our session towards the end of the week. Again, our communication, so if our players are playing with other teams or even other sports, it's communicating with managers where we can, making sure that those players are being looked after as much as possible, that they're not doing double the load, but that we can make sure that we still both have time with those players. So maybe the high intensity stuff they're doing with one group and they're doing something else. They're maybe doing skill work instead when they're with the other group and then switching over. But if we don't open those lines of communication, we could risk our players doing double the amount of work, getting less of the recovery, and then being more prone or more at risk of injury as a result. Managing players then with previous injuries. So as we've seen in the AFL, 85% of the players who suffered from hamstring injuries had hamstring injuries before. So it's making sure that our lines of communication with those players are open, that we are checking in on how those previous injuries are, if they've had any niggles or anything with those, but also looking at other injuries. So they might have had a hamstring injury before, but now their back is starting to get a little bit tight. So that's automatically giving us a red flag that can we get them to be looked at by a physio and just make sure that they're doing any kind of rehab or prehab that they can to make sure that they're going to stay on the field as long as possible as well. One other thing that we can look at and do as well is getting our players to keep a training diary. So if we're seeing a player who is maybe not performing as well as we would expect, if they have kept a training diary, which we can just have a quick look at, we might see that, yes, they're training twice a week, they have a match at the weekend, but maybe they're then in the gym 3 or 4 days a week, and it's starting to give us more information to see what they're doing, which we can then maybe pull them back a little bit from gym sessions if that's what they're doing, or maybe it's other things that they're doing, other sport or whatever it is. But if we have that information, and as well it gives them an awareness of how much they're doing, and maybe opens their eyes a little bit to seeing that actually they're not getting as much recovery as they need. So a very simple thing, doesn't have to be something that you're constantly keeping an eye on, but it gives them a little bit of awareness. And if you're seeing any kind of anything happen or any decrease in performance, that it can just give you that little bit more information as to why that might be happening. Moving on then from our training onto our recovery. So our training alone is not going to improve fitness. We need recovery in order to get that benefit. So recovery is vital to ensuring improved performance as a result of the training we're doing. So we call this a super compensation principle, where we train, we get fatigued because of that training, and it's only from the recovery that we then see the increase in performance. So without that recovery, we don't get that increase in performance, and also it's leading us open to a greater risk of injury. So research done in European soccer, and this is actually nothing, this isn't kind of a COVID related, just generally in terms of lack of recovery. So teams that had less than 72 hours between games suffered 20% more muscle injuries than teams who had 6 to 10 days between games. So it's just showing us that there's a really, really strong relationship between fatigue and injury. And we really need to pay attention to both acute fatigue and also accumulated fatigue. So fatigue that's happening after that training session or after that match, where we need to recover for the next session, but also over the course of a number of weeks. So we might have a number of games week on week, and then we have a recover, or we have a week off before the next, or 2 weeks off, effectively a weekend break before the next game. It's important that we don't just schedule another high intensity session and try to get as much in as possible, because our players will have built up over the number of weeks where they've had games, game after game, they will have built up a need for recovery, and they'll have built up fatigue and need that recovery for the next game. So it's important that we resist the urge to just cram as much in as possible and make sure that we're giving our players enough recovery in order to benefit and see that improvement in performance. There's a number of, I suppose, recovery strategies we can use. We obviously have our sleep, our nutrition and hydration, and they're the big kind of rocks that we're going to be looking at tonight to kind of help benefit our physical training. We also have a number of other areas that we can look at. So our ice baths, compression gear, foam rolling, massage, that kind of thing. But they're more the 1%ers. Even ice baths, the research there now shows that it's actually probably slowing down recovery as opposed to speeding it up, and is really kind of only beneficial if I have a game today and a game tomorrow, where I can have an ice bath tonight after the game and feel a lot better for the game tomorrow. But in terms of having a game week on week or in 2 weeks, the ice baths are actually probably going to slow down the inflammation process and therefore the recovery process before the next game. So the things that we really need to focus on are our sleep, our nutrition, and our hydration. You will get small benefits from your compression gear, your foam rolling, your massage, but if we're not nailing the big things, those other things aren't going to make too much of a difference to us. So if we look at sleep first, I suppose a very common sense will tell us that a lack of sleep is going to have a significant effect on our physical and our mental performance, but it's also going to have a added risk of injury as a result. So a study done here is showing that on average, a athlete who sleeps less than 8 hours per night will have a 1.7 times greater risk of being injured than those who sleep less than or 8 hours or less, which is quite significant. So sleeping 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, even 8 hours, or just below 8 hours, we're seeing a 1.7 times greater risk of injury. So the recommendation for athletes is to sleep 8 to 10 hours a night. Now, obviously, that's quite a lot. And one thing that is probably against us as an amateur sport is that our players probably aren't hitting that 8 hours, never mind 10 hours of sleep a night. So encouraging them to, as much as possible, hit at least that 8 hours. But there's also research behind taking naps. 20-minute nap can improve performance, and we can use that maybe as a way to top up that sleep if our players aren't getting it, because that will reduce the risk of injury otherwise. Moving on to nutrition. So again, we know that it will have a significant effect on performance. So whether that is a positive effect or a negative effect, we want to know how well our players are fueling for performance, but also how well they're refueling after our training sessions or after our games. So we want to know if they're eating enough, if they're eating at the right times. And one way that we can help players with that is to get them to keep a food diary. So similar to our training diary, if we get them to keep a food diary even for the course of a week, it can create awareness for them around what they're eating and drinking, and give them a little bit more of an idea of what habits they are in, because it's very easy to get stuck in these habits but actually not be really aware of it. So they might, if they keep a food diary, they might realize, oh, actually, I have quite a big gap between eating when I wake up and then eating again. It might be simple things like that. They might have too big of a gap between eating before they go out for training or before going for a match. And little things like just having that written down on paper and them keeping an account of it can just open their eyes to it a little bit, to see what habits they have. Even maybe it's a habit of eating the same meal every day and not getting that variety. In Sligo, we're very much on a food first approach, and we want our players to eat. We want to make sure they're getting variety through their meals, and even just that simple thing of keeping a food diary can help just give them that awareness around what they're eating and how they can improve on it. We're really lucky to, over the course of lockdown, have both Aoife Clancy and Emma Brennan coming in to do a webinar on understanding nutrition for sports performance. The girls were joined by Paul McNamara, our senior player here in Sligo, and have done a fantastic webinar. It might be slightly biased, but it's a brilliant webinar on sports nutrition, and is a great resource that we can guide our players towards, particularly now as we're coming into championship time. Finally then, in terms of recovery, we have hydration. So again, is going to affect physical and mental performance. So a water loss of just 2% of a player's body weight has a significant effect on physical and mental performance. What we have here is just a simple poster that we can use for players to do a urine colour test. So we can stick these up in the bathrooms in the club, or even just send it out to the players through their groups, and get the players to check the colour of their urine in order to see if they're hydrated or dehydrated. Really, really simple and really useful for our players to use. And it's just, again, that awareness around whether they're hydrated or not. We can also use weigh-ins before and after trainings or matches. So we get our players to come in, weigh themselves before they go out. When they come back in, weigh themselves again, just making sure they're in the same gear, whether it's their shorts and their jersey, making sure when they come back in, they're in the same gear to weigh back in. And a very simple, for every 1 kg of body weight that they lose, then the recommendation is to drink 1.5 litres of water. So if they only lose half a kg, then they're drinking 3/4 of a litre of water. And that's not just within, so if that training session, they're back in at 9 o'clock and they've lost a kg, they don't need to drink 1.5 litres of water before they go to bed. But over the course of the next morning as well, they can rehydrate and use as well the colour, the chart and the urine colour test to make sure that they're getting rehydrated. And that brings us then, I suppose, to just recapping over how we can manage our player load to minimise the risk of injury over the next month or so. So looking again at our planning and varying our weekly training intensity around matches, making sure we're not doing too high intensity and high load training sessions between games. If they're on a weekly schedule, making sure that we vary that load. Yes, we can keep intensity in there, but we're reducing the volume of that second session so that they're being tapered in to the next game. Our communication, again, being really, really important. So communicating with our players and also communicating with other managers if players are playing more than one team, using our RPE to gauge how hard they feel a session was. And again, communicating with them to monitor any previous injuries or any current niggles that they have, and making sure that we're adapting our training or adapting their training for them. Our diary then again, so making sure that they keep a training diary, so that can be the sessions that they do, any outside sessions that they do. It can be for sleep, it can be for food and hydration as well. Now, I don't recommend that we give them all of that at once. So it might be a case of, okay, for this week, keep a diary for your food. Maybe next week it's for sleep. The week after it's for training, so just that it's not too much all at once, because you'll probably end up coming back with them just forgetting about it completely. At least if we ease them into it and explain to them why they're doing it and how it can help, we might have more success with it. Our webinars then, so Dara mentioned we had other webinars already this year. So our nutrition one with Emma and Aoife and Paul, and then also a mental skills and mental well-being webinar that we've done as well with Carl Sheridan. which both are a brilliant resource for us to have. They're here on the Sligo GAA Coaching and Games YouTube channel, and are a great resource for our players to have coming in, especially into this time of the year. And then finally, with our hydration, just using our urine colour test and our hydration weigh-ins. And that really is, I suppose, the strategies that we can use in order to keep our players fit and healthy and on the field. And it's all very simple stuff. It's all stuff that we can do, and I suppose a very common sense way to look at things, but it really is about nailing the basics, and really kind of maybe pulling back a little bit at times in order to make sure that we get recovery, and are then able to, I suppose, improve performance as a result of that recovery, as opposed to just overdoing things and trying to get as much done as possible in as little time as possible. So really that's kind of, I suppose, the whole picture of what we can do over the next few weeks to keep our players on the field. If you have any questions or there's anything that you'd like a little bit more information on, feel free to send an email, or my social media channels are there as well. If you want to get in touch via those, I'm happy to answer any questions, and help out in whatever way I can. So feel free to get in touch if you have any other questions. Thank you very much.